Hello, this screencast is going to try and give you a bit of an overview of these next steps. And the next steps are that we're going to move the data from out of controllers, and instead we're going to put it inside a service. Right, so let's have a look at what a service is. In actual fact, in Angular we can use a service or a factory and then just vary, not in their functionality, but really in the syntax that we use to code them. I'm using a service because I just happen to prefer that. So we've got our course application and we're attaching to it that dot at the end. We're chaining the call to the built-in Angular service. And the first argument to this is the name of the service that I'm going to create. So that could be anything we want. I'm calling mine data service. And then the next thing I'm passing in is an array. And the first elements of the array are the dependencies that we're going to need inside here. So I'm passing in something called queue, which handles something called a promise, which is a way of dealing with asynchronous data calls. I'm going to leave that explanation as that. You can go and look up promises if you want to find out more about how they work. So I'm passing in this dependency of a promise, and I'm also passing in dependency of an HTTP. All of the variables, by the way, built into Angular are prefixed with $sign so that you can recognize them. Notice they're passed in as strings. And then this is the function that is this data service. And here we have arguments passed in, which are in the same order of the dependencies. So Q is the promise and $HTTP is the AJAX call. Inside this function, I've set up a simple variable I'm calling EarlBase, which points to a particular JSON file on the hard disk. Ultimately, that will be replaced with a PHP file, which will actually look up things in a database and return courses. But for the time being, I'm just putting the courses in an external file, which is at least one stage better than having them embedded inside the controller itself. And then also inside this function being the service, I've got a function called getCourses, which is going to retrieve that data in some way, shape or form. Then in my controller, I've added an extra dependency here. We previously only had $scope. I've now got data service, in other words, the name that I used for my service here. So I've now got access to that service. So this function, which is my course controller, I've added the data service as an extra argument, and inside it I've defined a function called getCourses. And at the end of this function, in other words, this is like initialization of my course controller, I actually call that function called getCourses. I've done that because then later on I can add some other information in here and some other initialization, and only at the end call getCourses. Okay, so let's have a look at what getCourses does. Well, getCourses goes to the data service, passed in as an argument, remember, and calls its getCourses. And when it receives a reply, then it will do something. It will do this if the reply was, okay, we've got a success. It will do this if there was an error in response to calling getCourses, and it will do this if there's a notify event happens. So let's go and look at data service getCourses, see what it does. So data service getCourses then, first of all, and this is more to do with that promise, it calls queue.defer and stores the result in here. So defer is in actual fact now an object that's going to handle all the promises for me. In other words, it's going to handle this asynchronous communication. And then what happens, we've set up a promise, and then what happens is we actually call HTTP, our AJAX service, calling get, passing the URL that we've used, in other words, this hard-coded JSON file here. And then chained to that call to get is a success function and an error function. So if the get is successful, it will call this, and if there's a failure, it will call this. And then right at the end, by the way, before that actually gets invoked, because in a way that's being invoked and running, and whilst it's running, we return the promise. So in other words, we return the promise to our call to data service get courses. So that's why then we'll only be finally called when that promise that's been returned is somehow honoured or rejected. So let's see what happens if the promise is actually honoured. So, and we've got a dot success here, so that call to success is chained. So if we're successful, then we resolve that promise we've made. In other words, we honour it. By the way, if the call was unsuccessful, then we'd reject the promise instead of resolving the promise if there was an error. But we're resolving the promise, and basically what's happened is that we've got a response. You know, our get gives us a response back, some sort of data in some way, shape or form. And that response that we've got has got some results in it in the course code. Can I actually show you that? I'll put that up on the screen in a moment and show you what that data looks like that we've actually got in courses JSON. But the results are an array of all of the courses, and the course code is a property that tells how many courses there actually are. And I'm storing that inside this object literal, starts with that brace and ends with that brace. It's got a property called data, which contains our array of courses, and a property called row count, which contains whatever that equals, the number of courses. So that's returned when the promise is resolved. So in our course controller, when then is invoked, if the promise is resolved, then this function will be called. And what this function does is it gets the response from that data service. In other words, it gets this data that's returned. So therefore, inside here, we can refer to response.rowCount and response.data, where if you remember, data was the array of courses and row count was how many courses there were. So row count plus that string I'm storing into a property called course count attached to scope so that it can be available inside the HTTP snippets that are linked to this. And I'm also attaching that data, which is the array of courses, into a property called courses. That's exactly the same as it was before, except that before courses equaled, in quotes, then a literal of all of our courses. So that's meant to give you a kind of basic overview. You probably need to play this several times to get some vague idea of what I'm talking about in the structure. And then when you come to go on and look at the course code in the code for this application in detail, hopefully that overview will make it kind of make a bit more sense to you. Thanks a lot.